The air on a heavy-lift barge carries the scent of diesel, salt, and steel. But that morning, it carried something else, the end of my career. "You're fired, Caleb," Charles Whitmore said, his voice as cold as the steel modules we transported. I nodded, gathered my gear, and walked away with the only copy of the lift plan in my pocket. His $120 million oil refinery module would sit floating for 2 weeks. The firing happened in the barge's cramped office, the smell of stale coffee and diesel exhaust seeping through the vents. Charles Whitmore III, CEO, owner, and my boss for 12 years, sat behind a metal desk scarred with weld marks and coffee rings. He didn't look up from the paperwork when I entered. "Caleb," he said without greeting, "we need to talk." I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "What's up, Charles?" He finally met my eyes, his expression unreadable. "The board's concerned about costs. Your overtime's been excessive." I kept my face neutral. The overtime was from covering for the 3 riggers he laid off last month. "The module transport schedule is tight. We're working with a skeleton crew as it is. That's exactly the problem." He shuffled papers. "We're bringing in a consulting firm. New procedures, more efficient." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "Consulting firm? What about the Mexico City module?" "It arrives in 48 hours. He waved a dismissive hand. "That's why we're making changes. We'll hire another rigger to handle the day-to-day. You'll train them, then transition out." The words hit me like a physical blow. 12 years. I'd started as a deckhand, worked my way up to lead rigger. I knew every cable, every winch, every tide pattern for 200 miles. I knew how the barge listed when the crane was fully extended. I knew which welds were solid and which ones we'd patched in emergencies. "You're firing me," I said quietly. He sighed as if I were being difficult. "We're restructuring. You'll get a severance package. 2 weeks' pay for every year. 2 weeks per year." It was generous, but it wasn't about the money. It was about respect. It was about knowing that I'd kept this operation running through storms, through equipment failures, through crew shortages. "I need your badge, your keys, and any company property," he continued. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the badge metal, worn smooth on the edges. I placed it on his desk. Then I hesitated. "And the lift plan for the Mexico City module," he said as an afterthought. "Give that to Javier before you go." I didn't move. The lift plan was in my other pocket, folded and creased from weeks of reference. It wasn't just a diagram. It was the culmination of my experience. It showed the exact sequence of lifts, the tension calculations, the contingency plans for wind and current. It accounted for the barge's specific ballast system, the crane's reach limitations, the module's center of gravity. It was irreplaceable. "Caleb," Whitmore said, his patience thinning. "The plan." I looked him in the eye. "I don't have it. Don't lie to me. I saw you with it yesterday. I gave it to Javier." I said, my voice steady. He frowned. "Well then, get it from him and bring it here." I shook my head slowly. "No." His face reddened. "What did you say?" I said, "No." "You want to fire me? Fine, but I'm not handing over the plan." "Caleb, that's company property. That's theft." "It's my work," I corrected. "Then you're not getting it." He stood up, his chair scraping the metal floor. "You're making a big mistake. We'll hire another rigger, someone younger, cheaper, someone who can read the plan." I almost laughed. The plan wasn't something you just read. It was something you understood through experience. The notations and the margins were just numbers. They were lessons learned from near disasters. The highlighted sections marked the spots where the barge would sway in certain winds. The asterisks indicated where we'd had to reinforce welds. "I'm sure you'll find someone," I said, my voice calm. "Good luck with that." I turned and walked out, my boots echoing on the metal stairs. In the crew quarters, I grabbed my duffel bag, clothes, toiletries, the small photo of my daughter. I didn't look at anyone. I just walked down the gangplank and onto the dock, my pocket heavy with the folded papers. I didn't look back, but I knew with a grim certainty that the $120 million module would sit floating until someone realized what they'd lost. The drive home was a blur of coastal highway and salt air. My truck, a 15-year-old Ford with rust on the wheel wells, felt like a sanctuary. I threw my bag in the back and slid into the driver's seat, the lift plan a solid weight in my jacket pocket. I stared at the steering wheel for a long time, my mind racing. What had I done? I was 52 years old with a mortgage and a daughter in college. I'd just quit my job in the most dramatic way possible. I'd basically stolen company property. But had I stolen it? The plan was mine. I'd created it. Whitmore may have owned the paper, but the knowledge on it came from my head, my hands, my years on that barge. I pulled out the folded papers and smoothed them on the seat. It was a mess of engineering diagrams, handwritten notes, and coffee stains. To anyone else, it would look like gibberish. To me, it was a map of my professional life. There was the note from the storm last year, wind 25 knots equals delay. Barge, this 3 degrees to port. There was the calculation for the extra sling we'd added after the near drop in 19. There were the margin calculations for the new crane attachment we'd jury-rigged when the original broke. This was my legacy, and I was holding it in my hands, warm from my body heat. I thought about calling my wife Sarah. She'd be worried, but she wouldn't understand. She'd see the lost income, the uncertainty. She wouldn't see the principle of it. I thought about calling a lawyer. Could they prove I'd taken it? Probably. But would they care? Corporate espionage cases didn't usually involve a middle-aged rigger and a lift plan. I thought about what would happen when the Mexico City module arrived. The consulting firm would show up with their laptops and their degrees. They'd look at the barge, at the crane, at the module. They'd scratch their heads. They'd try to create a new plan, and they'd fail. Because you can't learn the temperament of a barge from a textbook. You can't calculate the feel of a cable under tension. You can't predict how the current will push a floating module when the tide changes. I was 52. I'd given half my life to Whitmore Marine Construction, and in return, I got 2 weeks' notice and a pat on the back. The anger started as a slow burn in my chest and spread through my limbs. It wasn't just anger at Whitmore. It was anger at myself for staying so long, for accepting me overtime as normal, for believing that loyalty would be rewarded. I smoothed the plan one more time, then folded it carefully and slipped it back in my pocket. It was more than paper. It was my expertise, my value, my bargaining chip, and I knew exactly what to do with it. 2 days later, I was sipping coffee at the dockside diner when I saw the chaos unfold. The Mexico City module, officially Module Alpha, but we all called it the big one, was due to arrive at 0600 hours. I'd been checking the marine traffic app on my phone obsessively. It showed the heavy lift ship approaching, then slowing, then stopping a mile offshore. I took another sip of coffee and watched through the diner window as Whitmore's new consulting team swarmed the barge. They had that look: crisp khakis, shiny boots, tablets in hand. They were talking animatedly, pointing at the crane, at the barge, at the water. Javier was there, looking grim. He was the only one who knew what was really going on. He'd called me last night, his voice low. "Caleb, they don't have the plan. They're trying to wing it." "What's happening?" "The consulting guy, some engineer from Houston, he's trying to calculate the lift based on the module specs. But he's not accounting for the barge's list. And he doesn't know about the current shift at the river mouth. I'd told him not to worry. Let them try. They'll figure it out soon enough." And they were figuring out. I watched as the consultant, a young guy with a beard and a confident stride, climbed the crane. He examined the controls, then came down shaking his head. He consulted his tablet, then walked to the edge of the barge and looked at the module, which was now anchored offshore. Whitmore arrived in his BMW, looking impatient. He strode onto the barge and started yelling. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his gestures. He was pointing at the module, at the crane, at his watch. The consultant tried to explain something, pointing at his tablet. Whitmore cut him off, his face red. He turned and looked toward the shore, as if searching for something. Our eyes met for a second. I was sitting in the diner, 50 yards away. I raised my coffee cup in a mock salute. He looked away quickly. By noon, the module was still sitting there. The tide was changing. The current was picking up. The barge was starting to list more than usual. I finished my coffee and paid my bill. As I walked out, I saw Whitmore on his phone, his voice raised, probably to the board, probably trying to explain why a $120 million asset was doing nothing. I smiled to myself and got in my truck. The plan in my pocket felt lighter somehow. I wasn't just holding paper anymore. I was holding the key to his problem, and I had no intention of giving it to him. The phrase haunted Whitmore for 48 hours. At first, he dismissed it. "We'll hire another rigger" was just a statement, a business decision. But as the big one sat offshore, as the tide turned and the current picked up, the words echoed in his skull like a curse. He heard them in the board's questions. Why isn't the module berthed? He heard them in the consultant's reports. Without the original lift plan, we're estimating a 40% safety margin too high for this operation. He heard them in his own voice when he called the 3 riggers he'd laid off, the ones who'd left for better jobs off the coast. All of them were gone. On the 3rd morning, Whitmore found himself standing at the barge's rail, staring at Module Alpha. The 120 million refinery component destined for a plant in Mexico bobbed gently in the swells, a white elephant that was starting to look more like a white flag. Javier approached, his boots clanging on the metal deck. "Mornin', Mr. Mond." "Whitmore." "Morning, Javier." Whitmore didn't turn. "Any progress?" Javier hesitated. "The new engineer Tommy's trying, but the barge's ballast system is temperamental, and the current at the river mouth is shifting earlier than expected." Whitmore finally looked at him. "Can't we just create a new plan? Use the engineering specs from the module manufacturer?" Javier shook his head. "The specs give us the weight, the dimensions, the center of gravity, but they don't tell us how this specific barge will react. They don't tell us that when the crane swings to port with a full load, the barge lists 4.2 degrees and the hose connections need to be slackened half a turn. They don't tell us that the third cable from the left, the one we replaced last year, has a slightly different elasticity than the others." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "So we need Caleb." Javier said nothing. The accusation hung in the air. Whitmore turned back to the module. "I fired him. I told him we'd hire another rigger." Javier's voice was quiet. "And now you're finding out why that wasn't true." The words landed like a slap. Whitmore had built his business on the idea that management could solve any problem with enough data, enough analysis, enough money. He'd seen his employees as interchangeable parts, replaceable, measurable, optimizable. But Caleb wasn't a part. He was the knowledge, the intuition, the thousand small adjustments that came from 12 years of watching the barge breathe and sweat and sometimes stumble. "We'll hire another rigger," Whitmore muttered to himself. It sounded so simple, so stupid. Javier Rodriguez had worked with Caleb for 11 of those 12 years. They'd shared coffee in the rain, cursed at bulky equipment, celebrated successful lifts with cheap beer. He knew what Caleb had taken with him when he walked off that barge. He also knew what Whitmore was facing. On the afternoon of the third day, Whitmore called Javier into the cramped office, the same office where Caleb had been fired. The air still smelled of tension and old coffee. "Javier," Whitmore began, "I need you to be straight with me. Can we get this module berth without Caleb?" Javier sat down, his massive frame making the metal chair groan. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been a rigger for 34 years. I've worked on barges from Alaska to Chile, and I've never seen anyone read a barge like Caleb. But can we do it?" "Sir, the lift plan isn't just about the module. It's about this barge. It's about how the wind pushes us when we're fully extended. It's about how the tide changes the angle of the mooring lines. It's about which welds are original and which ones we've reinforced and by how much." Whitmore leaned forward. "So you can figure it out. You and Tom, you can create a new plan." Javier shook his head. "I could give you 80% of it, maybe 90% on a good day, but that last 10%, that's the difference between a successful lift and a disaster. That's the part that comes from watching the barge for 12 years. That's the part that's in Caleb's head." Whitmore ran a hand through his thinning hair. "What's the worst that could happen?" Javier named the possibilities like he was reading a grocery list. "We could tear a sling. We could list too far and strain the hose connections. We could misjudge the current and swing into the dock. We could drop the module." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant groan of the barge's hull settling in the water. "How much would it cost to bring him back?" Whitmore asked quietly. "Given the way you fired him?" Javier shrugged. "He'd probably tell you to go to hell, and I wouldn't blame him." Whitmore looked down at his hands. "I need options." "You have one option," Javier said. "You need to talk to Caleb. Not as your employee, not as someone you can buy back. You need to talk to him as the only person who can save your $120 million investment." "And say what?" Javier stood up, the chair scraping loudly. "You'll figure it out. You're the CEO." He walked out, leaving Whitmore alone with the weight of his mistake. Lisa Chen was a project manager at the bridge between the office and the crew. She'd seen Caleb's firing, and she'd known immediately that it was a mistake. But she'd also known that pointing it out would have been career suicide. Now, on the fourth day of the module's limbo, she sat in Whitmore's office with a damage assessment. "The board is asking questions," she said, sliding a tablet across the desk. "Shareholders are nervous. The client in Mexico is calling daily." Whitmore scanned the numbers. Delay penalties, equipment rental costs, reputational damage. It was already in the millions. "What's the crew saying?" he asked. Lisa chose her words carefully. "They're professionals. They're doing their jobs, but there's a frustration. They know we're operating without the full picture. And Tom, the new rigger, She hesitated. Tom is competent. He has his certification, but he's never worked on a heavy lift barge before. He's trying to learn, but some things can't be learned from a manual. Whitmore looked at her. Like what? Like the fact that when the barge is fully loaded and the crane is at maximum reach, the main bearing on the crane pedestal heats up. Not enough to fail, but enough that we need to reduce the lift speed by 15%. Like the fact that the third mooring line from the stern stretches more than the others when the tide is ebbing. Like the fact that the ballast pumps need to be cycled in a specific sequence to avoid listing too far when we're taking on a heavy load. She paused. Caleb knew these things without thinking. They were muscle memory for him. Whitmore rubbed his temples. So we're crippled because one man left with a piece of paper. It wasn't just a piece of paper, Lisa said softly. It was his experience, his judgment, his intuition. She stood to leave, then turned at the door. Mr. Whitmore, I respect you. You built this company. But you made a fundamental error. You confused a lift plan with a document. It's not. It's a record of expertise. And expertise can't be replaced by hiring another rigger. She left him alone with the tablet, the numbers blurring as the reality sank in. He had fired the knowledge, and now the knowledge was gone. I watched the new kid from my truck every morning for a week. Tom Wilson. 26 years old, fresh from some maritime academy, full of certificates and confidence. Whitmore had hired him 2 days after I left, touting him as the new rigger who would solve all their problems. I knew the moment I saw him that he wouldn't last. He showed up on day 3, dressed in brand new safety gear that still had creases from the package. He carried a tablet and a clipboard, and he walked the barge like he owned it. I watched from the diner as he examined the crane, the cables, the ballast system. He took notes. He made calculations. He looked important. By noon, he was at the rail, staring at Module Alpha like it was a puzzle he needed to solve. Javier stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I could imagine the conversation. Tom pointing at his tablet, tracing lines on a diagram. Javier shaking his head. Tom arguing, citing formulas. Javier finally walking away, disgusted. I sipped my coffee and smiled. This was the part where theory met reality and reality always won. On the 4th day, Tom tried the lift. I saw them preparing, securing the slings, checking the connections, testing the crane's movement. Whitmore was there, watching like a hawk. Lisa stood by the control panel, her face tight with concern. Javier was nowhere to be seen. The crane swung out, the cable descended, and the slings went over the module's lifting points. Everything looked perfect. Textbook. Then Tom started the lift. The crane's motor whined as it strained against the weight. The barge shifted, just slightly. The module rose a few feet out of the water. That's when it happened. The barge listed to port, not dramatically, but enough. The module swung with it, putting uneven pressure on the slings. One of the connections groaned. A warning alarm sounded. Tom reacted quickly, lowering the module back down. The damage was done. I saw the problem immediately. The ballast wasn't right. The barge was listing more than it should have given the load. That meant the ballast tanks weren't balanced, which meant someone had miscalculated the weight distribution. Or, more accurately, no one had calculated it correctly. Tom came down from the crane, his face pale. He was talking animatedly to Whitmore, gesturing at his tablet, then at the barge, then at the module. Whitmore was nodding, but his expression was getting darker by the second. Lisa approached, said something. Tom shook his head. Whitmore threw his hands in the air and stalked off. I finished my coffee. The new kid had just learned his first lesson on a heavy lift barge. Theory only gets you so far. After that, you need experience. And experience was what I had. I started my truck and drove home, the lift plan a comforting weight in my pocket. Let them struggle. Let them fail. They'd learn eventually. But by then, it might be too late. The board meeting was at 7 o'clock in the morning, Pacific time. Whitmore hated early meetings, but the situation demanded it. He stood at the window of his office, looking out at the barge. Module Alpha was still there, still floating, still mocking him. His phone rang. The board was on the line. He took a deep breath and answered. Whitmore, we've been looking at the delay reports, the chairman said without preamble. What's happening with the Mexico City module? It's complicated, Whitmore began. Charles, it's been 8 days. The penalties are approaching $5 million. The client is threatening to pull the contract. I understand that. We're working through some technical issues. What technical issues? What technical issues? You have one of the most experienced crews in the industry. What's the problem? Whitmore hesitated. He couldn't admit the truth, that he'd fired the one man who could solve the problem. That would make him look incompetent. That would make the board question his leadership. "We're implementing new procedures," he said, the words tasting like ash. "More efficient methods. There's a learning curve." Then, "Charles, we're looking at the quarterly reports. The losses from this delay are going to wipe out our profits for the year." "I'm aware of that." "Another thing," the chairman said, "we've been contacted by the insurance company. They're asking why the module hasn't been berthed. They're talking about breach of contract." Whitmore's stomach dropped. Insurance issues could get ugly fast. "I'll have an update for you by noon," he said, his voice tight. "You have until 5 o'clock. And Charles fixed this. He hung up and stared at the river. The barge sat there, innocent looking, while his world crumbled. He thought about calling Caleb. The man wouldn't answer. Even if he did, he'd probably laugh and hang up. He thought about offering him the job back, with a raise, with a promotion, with anything he wanted. But his pride wouldn't let him. Whitmore Marine Construction was his company. He did beg to his employees. He picked up the phone and called Lisa. "Get me the head of the consulting firm," he said. "The one who's supposed to be solving this. I want to know why they haven't solved it yet." He hung up and went back to the window. The module floated there, serene and expensive. And somewhere out there, Caleb Wallace was probably enjoying his morning coffee, knowing exactly what was happening and why. The thought made Whitmore's hands clench into fists. It happened on the 10th day. I was at the grocery store when I saw Whitmore's BMW pull into the parking lot. I watched in my rearview mirror as he got out, looking around nervously, and headed toward the diner. I knew it was coming. I'd been expecting it. I finished my shopping, put the groceries in the truck, and drove to the diner. I took my usual booth by the window and ordered coffee. 10 minutes later, Whitmore walked in. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, tired, stressed, his expensive suit looking rumpled. He scanned the room, saw me, and marched over. "Caleb," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I gestured to the seat across from me. "Sit down, Charles." He sat, his back rigid. "I want the lift plan." "I know you do." "This is ridiculous. The module is costing us millions. The board is breathing down my neck. The client is threatening legal action. And you think I care?" I took a sip of coffee. "You fired me, remember? You said we'd hire another rigger." His face flushed. "That was a business decision. Circumstances have changed." "Have they?" I leaned forward. "Or are you just realizing what you lost?" He stared at me, his jaw working. "I need that plan. And I need an apology." He blinked. "What? An apology?" "Not for firing me." "For what you said. For what you implied." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "We'll hire another rigger." I quoted his words back at him. "You made it sound like any idiot with a certificate could do my job. Like 12 years of experience meant nothing. Like the knowledge I gained, the hard way, the expensive way, was interchangeable." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant." I kept my voice calm even. "You disrespected me, Charles. You disrespected my profession, and now you're paying for it." He ran a hand through his hair. "What do you want?" "I want you to admit that you were wrong. Not just about firing me. About everything. About what a rigger does. About what experience is worth." He was silent for a long moment. Around us, the diner buzzed with normal life waitresses calling orders, kids laughing, the hiss of the espresso machine. No one had any idea that a corporate war was being waged in his corner booth. Finally, he spoke. "You were right, Caleb. I was wrong. I thought management could solve any problem. I thought expertise was just a matter of training. I was arrogant. It wasn't a great apology, but it was a start." "And," I prompted, "and I need your help. The company needs your help. The company needs your help. Please, give me the plan." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded papers. I smoothed them on the table, the coffee stains and margin notes clearly visible. "This isn't just a plan," I said. "It's my knowledge, my judgment, my experience. You can't just buy it back." "I'm not asking to buy it back. I'm not asking to buy it back," he said quickly. "I'm asking you to come back, to fix this. Name your price." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the desperation, the fear, the realization that his empire was crumbling because of his own pride. "I don't want your money," I said. "I want my job back, with the same pay and benefits, and I want a written apology to the crew for what you said about them." He nodded eagerly. "Done. Anything else?" I thought for a moment. "I want to be consulted on all future operations." Not just as a rigger, as an expert. My experience has value, and I want it recognized. Agreed. I slid the plan across the table. Then we have a deal. He reached for it, but I stopped his hand. One more thing, I said. The apology to the crew happens first, in front of everyone. Then I'll give you the plan. Then we'll get that module berthed. He nodded, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. Fine. When? Now. I have a meeting with the crew in 20 minutes. I stood up, crumpling the plan slightly in my hand. You have until then to decide if you're really sorry. I walked out, leaving him sitting there. The weight of his choices heavy in the air. The confrontation was over, but the real test was still to come. The crew gathered on the barge's main deck at 2 p.m. sharp. Word had spread fast. Charles Whitmore was going to apologize. Some showed up out of curiosity, others out of disbelief. Javier stood at the front, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Lisa hovered near the crane control panel, her arms also crossed, her face a mask of skepticism. Whitmore arrived precisely on time, the lift plan clutched in his hand. He looked uncomfortable in his suit among the work boots and safety vests. He cleared his throat and stepped onto a small crate to address the group. Crew, he began, his voice lacking its usual authority. I owe you an apology. No one said anything. They just waited. I made a mistake, he continued. A big one. I fired Caleb Wallace. And in doing so, I dismissed 12 years of experience, 12 years of knowledge, 12 years of dedication to this company. He paused, looking around at the faces, some angry, some hurt, some just tired. I told him we'd hire another rigger. I said it like it was nothing, like any certified person could do what he did. I was wrong. He took a breath. The truth is, I don't know how to run a heavy lift operation. I know how to run a business, but I don't know how to read a barge, how to feel a cable, how to anticipate a current. That's what Caleb does. That's what all of you do. He held up the lift plan. This isn't just a document. It's a record of expertise, and I treated it like it was disposable. He looked directly at Javier. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for what I did. And I'm sorry for the position I put you all in. He stepped down from the crate and handed the plan to Javier. Give this to Caleb. Tell him I'm ready to get back to work. The crew dispersed without a word. No one cheered. No one clapped. But the tension in the air had shifted from anger to something colder, more final. Whitmore had admitted his mistake, but the damage was done. The Mexico City module was birthed 2 days later. With the lift plan back in hand, I worked with Javier and Tom to execute the lift. It went perfectly, no listing, no alarms, no near disasters, just smooth, professional work. Afterward, Whitmore approached me as I was packing up my gear. Thank you, Caleb, he said, his voice quiet. You saved us. I finished coiling a rope before I answered. Don't thank me. Just remember this moment. He nodded, as if he knew there was nothing more to say. I walked off the barge for the second time in 2 weeks, but this time was different. I wasn't being fired. I wasn't being humiliated. I was leaving on my own terms, with my dignity intact. Sarah was waiting in the truck, a small smile on her face. Now to go. I got the module berthed. I know. I saw from the diner. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You did the right thing. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. The anger was gone. The frustration was gone. The frustration was gone. All that remained was a quiet satisfaction. I had stood up for myself. I had proven my worth, and I had walked away with my self-respect. A week later, I got a call from a competitor, Oceanic Marine Transport. They'd heard what happened. They offered me a job. Better pay, better benefits, more respect. I took it. Sometimes walking away is the most powerful thing you can do. It's been 3 months since I left Whitmore Marine Construction. I see the news occasionally: shareholder disputes, management changes, whispers of a buyout. The company's still running, but it's not the same. They never did find another rigger like me. They hired a few more consultants, implemented more procedures, but something's missing. The intuition, the feel, the knowledge that can't be written down. I'm at Oceanic now. They treat me with respect. They listen to my experience. They value what I bring to the table. Last week I was on a barge in the Gulf of Mexico. We were lifting a similar module. Not as big as the Mexico City one, but still substantial. The new crew was nervous. The weather was changing. The tide was shifting. I stood at the rail, feeling the barge beneath my feet, watching the sky, sensing the water. Tom, I said to the young rigger on my crew, Check the ballast on the port side. The tide's turning early. He looked confused. How do you know? I smiled. You just feel it after a while. He went to check, and sure enough, the ballast was off. We adjusted, and the lift went smoothly. As I watched the module settle into place, I thought about Whitmore. I thought about his arrogance, his dismissal, his comeuppance. I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. I had proven my point. I had stood my ground. I had walked away with my dignity, and I had never once regretted it.